Hey everybody, this is Mike with Freeroaming Photography, and spring has sprung here in Jackson Hole, so I'm going through my favorite photos from the winter of 2023-2024. And along the way, I'll be telling you what I like about the photos so much, as well as technical information on how I achieved the shot, and maybe there's one or two things I could have done differently. So, if you find any of this helpful, keep in mind I also do private photography workshops here in Grand Teton National Park and Yellowstone National Park. You can check out the links for those in the description. And without further ado, let's get going. Okay, so just for clarification, I am defining winter as roughly November 1st through April 15th. That is usually pretty much winter here, and the snow doesn't really start thawing until then, and in terms of November, the beginning, it usually doesn't really start sticking until then. Accumulating might be a better word. So, starting with November 1st, here are 20 photos that I really enjoyed from this past season. Okay, this, I couldn't have asked for a better shot. Belted kingfishers are shy birds, and this one was perched in a perfect place, perfect lighting. I mean, everything just lined up perfectly for this one, so probably one of the best shots I've ever gotten of a belted kingfisher, maybe the best one. And obviously the lighting was beautiful, so couldn't pass this one up. This was along the Moose Wilson Road, and I was actually heading out for a hike along the Moose Wilson Road, which had closed for the season by then, but it's open for winter sports, which at the time there wasn't enough snow, so I was just going for a walk along it. This was before I got to the closure, so he was just perched right there in the bushes and just getting hit with perfect lighting. This was at ISO 2000, and I was shooting at f8 at 1/4000th of a second. And I was at f8. I probably could have gotten away with f4, but in this case, I had a doubler, a 2x extender on my 500mm lens, which allowed me to get twice the reach, but it also doubles your aperture. And really, I only do that if I'm shooting smaller birds, which came into play with a lot of these photos. And in some cases, just because of the situation, I happen to leave it on for other wildlife, which we'll see coming up. Now, along that walk, I went back along the Snake River. I found a little path to go back there and noticed an American dipper. And I was trying to get some good shots of it. I walked down a pretty steep and unstable rocky bank to get down to the river and was able to catch this American dipper actually catching some food, and really loved how the splashing of the water came around and kind of spread throughout the whole frame, and I just thought it was a really cool shot. So same thing, small bird, I had that 2x extender on, and this was at ISO 4000, f8, and 1/2500th of a second. And I wanted to get that really fast shutter speed to freeze the action. I knew he was splashing around, it goes by really quick, so I wanted to make sure it was frozen and not blurred through the image, which is a nice look as well, but just having those little water droplets freezing there in the moment, and you can tell what's going on, I really like that a lot. Next one is down on the National Elk Refuge. The bighorn sheep had migrated in, and they are always so much fun to watch. And this bighorn sheep especially was obviously in a pretty tight spot. He was up on the rocks trying to figure out where to go. They have little rubber pads on their feet that allow them to stick to these really, what would be for us, very unsafe ledges. So I love the way this one just looks like it blends right into the rocks, and it's trying to figure out where to go and what the best route would be. The settings for this one, I had my extender on again, and this was at ISO 1600 with 1/1250th of a second at f8. With larger mammals, you don't really need to freeze that much action. I got away with a lower shutter speed, even if he was running. And he's not as quick as a bird. The bigger they are, the less action you need to freeze, so you can get away with a lower shutter speed. And that was where I was going with that. So the Geminid meteor shower peaks every December. And I certainly wanted to get out and try to get something. And we were having a lot of nice, clear weather. Winter was unusually late this season. So even though there was some snow on the ground, we had a lot of clear days, not as much snow as would normally be there. So the road to the Molten Barns was still open, and I took advantage. So this is the TA Molten Barn. The John Molten Barn usually gets a little bit more traffic, which is why I prefer this one. I just kind of like that it's a little quieter. And did happen to catch one of the Geminids above it, which was really nice. Beautiful sky. You can see a lot of the light pollution though coming up into the sky from the town of Jackson, from the airport as well. Hopefully dark sky certification will fix that if we ever get there. Otherwise, really love this image. Came out really nice, and a nice meteor streaking over the top of it. Even though there is light pollution all the way out at the Molten Barns, it's a really dark sky. So I cranked up the ISO to 6400, and that allowed me to shoot at f2.8 with a 30-second exposure and get a really nice exposure from that. And there's a number of ways to reduce noise when you're up at that high of an ISO. You can use Lightroom's newer light noise reduction, as well as image stacking, where you take a series of images, stack them together in dark sky stacking software, and that'll average out the noise, essentially minimizing it. And I shot at 2.8. When you're doing night photography, you want the lowest possible aperture you can get. A lot of lenses will go lower. They'll go more wide open at 2.8. But a lot of times what happens is they get a little bit more distorted. You see more distortion as you get toward 1.8 or something like that. And so I was trying to find that nice balance in between. But the more open the aperture is, the more light it's going to let in, which allows you to absorb more night sky features. This was a nice find. I was visiting family in Charleston with my daughter and was out on a boardwalk hike at a place called Shim Creek, which is a nice little pier that goes out into the water. And there's some wetlands you go through, and I was seeing all sorts of lifers out there. And this particular one was also out there. It was a salt marsh sparrow, and really liked that I caught it in the reed grass, kind of poking out. You could still see what it is, but it's still trying to like hide and be shy like a lot of the birds are. But this was my favorite shot that I got from that whole trip, and came out really nice. I really loved just the sort of playful look on it and the way I was kind of going in and out of the grasses. Now for this, I learned a valuable lesson. I took my 2x extender, but I didn't take my 500. I wanted to take a nice lens, so I took my 100 to 400, and I put the 2x extender on that, and don't ever do that. It's not a good idea. I did it just because I was there. I wanted the extra focal length, but in hindsight, it really wasn't worth it. As a result, the ISO for this one is 12,800, which, yeah, that you don't want to go that high on just an overcast day. So with the 2x extender on that 100 to 400, at 400, the aperture is usually f5.6, so you double that. Yeah, I got 800, but I was shooting at f11, which really didn't leave a whole lot of room for shutter speed. In this case, 1/800th of a second. And so had it been bouncing around, it would have been blurred. Luckily, it held still for that quick moment. But yeah, going back there, if that happens again, I'm not going to bring the 2x extender. It's not worth going that high with ISO. And sure, you could argue there's noise reduction, it works, but it's really not in good practice to just expect that you can clean up noise, because it's not going to always be that good, and you really lose some quality when you go up that high in terms of ISO. So you want to keep it lower. I certainly want to keep it lower, and this was a valuable lesson. It came out okay, but it probably could have been a little bit better, a little sharper, a little crisper, but still it works, and I was really happy with the moment itself, which is why I included it in here. So these next two are of black-capped chickadees. I really wanted to capture some black-capped chickadees. They are one of the year-round residents in terms of birds here, and they were all around where I live in Kelly. So they made easy subjects. This one in particular, I love the way it was flapping its wings and going through the spotted knapweed, which is unfortunately an invasive species, a rather toxic invasive species, which once it starts blooming here, I'm planning on doing a video to explain why it's so toxic. But in this case, a lot of the birds do poke through and try to find the seeds to eat. And this particular composition, I just really like the way it was scouring through, the way its wings are kind of spread out, the way, it's a good action scene of the bird searching through the dead flowers for seeds. And because it was a pretty overcast day, again, learned some lessons in terms of how much reach is worth it and how much ISO do you really want. In this case, it was overcast, it was dark, even with the snow. So I had the ISO turned up to 8,000 with the extender on and shooting at f8. That gave me 1/1250th of a second. So not a lot to freeze that action. Really had to crank up those settings, and in hindsight, probably wouldn't crank it up that high these days. I spent a few months trying out that 2x extender and seeing if it was worth it or not. And in a lot of cases, it is definitely worth it, but not all the time. So as mentioned, the next one is another black-capped chickadee. And this is just too perfect of a pose. It's on a branch without obstructions. It has a nice composition. Everything's kind of flowing down and to the right. There's nothing really interfering with the background, and it's just a really nice sort of almost monotone shot where you get just a little bit of color coming through, which I really like. I always like when you have just a really monotone image, when you have very subtle color coming in. It's not quite black and white, and you just sort of have that minimal color. And this image was just perfect for that. And again, the 2x extender, when you don't have a lot of light, here's the problem. ISO 10,000 at f8 gave me 1/320th of a second, which if it were going to fly, I would not have got it, because it was just, that's not enough shutter speed to freeze action with a bird like a chickadee, or really any bird. So I definitely could have taken that extender off and getting that extra speed back in the shutter speed by reducing the aperture. Okay, really nice bull moose, tiny antlers, but still great shot. Still a really moody shot in the fog out on the flats in the sagebrush. And that is because this was taken before sunrise. So regardless if I had that 2x extender on, the ISO is going to have to be cranked up, because prior to sunrise, there's not a lot of light, especially when you got fog. So the settings were definitely going to have to be cranked up on this, but either way, I love the subtle color, that sort of pastel look, and just a really moody shot of a really incredible moose, despite the tiny antlers. So for this one, I did want to shoot it at f8 because I wanted to keep the moose completely in focus, and that's still enough to separate it out from the background, especially with a long lens. So the settings for this, again, pre-sunrise, so ISO 8000 at f8 with 1/80th of a second. So not a lot to work with at all, very little light. So with this one, I was out shooting on the elk refuge, some bighorn sheep, other things, seeing what I could find. And I was driving out, and the fog was still hanging on to one or two of the hillsides, the mountainsides. And the sun had just come up over the mountain on the east side and was making these spectacular rays coming through the trees on this one particular hillside. I thought this was just a gorgeous scene. Had to stop and get it. Really glad I did, because it's a pretty stunning landscape. So for this one, like landscapes that I do, I go up to f16 to preserve all the depth. Creates a little bit of distortion around the edges, but with a good quality lens, it's not that noticeable and it doesn't affect too much. The ISO was at 500, which these days is not that big of a deal, but it's still probably a little higher than it needed to be, because that put my shutter speed at 1/2000th of a second, which is quite excessive for a landscape, but at the same time, there was a lot of light coming in that scene, so it wasn't too big of a deal. Now this one I like a lot, partially because it's just a nice shot of a common redpoll, but also because of what was going on when I shot it. Some snow had just fallen, it was freezing outside, as you can tell from the frost on the spotted knapweed, and this flock of, if it's a flock of common redpolls, came and landed and started feeding on them right outside my front door. And my daughter, who I have part-time, was there with me, and we both grabbed our cameras. She was still 3 at the time, and she has a little toddler camera. It's kind of one of those ones that fits into a toddler's hands and is made to be dropped. So she was shooting with me right out my front door as this flock of redpolls just feeded and kept moving on. So this was a really fun experience to be there with my daughter shooting at the same time, who was only 3, at these beautiful little birds that I actually fell in love with over the winter. For the settings with the extender, I was at ISO 3200, which isn't too bad, at f8, which gave me 1/1250th of a second. And that was about as low as I would go with birds this small to try to freeze the action. And to be honest, I probably would have wanted to get a little bit more, and it might have been worth taking that extender off in this case to get more shutter speed out of it, because 1/1250th of a second sounds fast, but with birds this small, I mean, these are smaller than sparrows, they're tiny. They move really fast, and you need something. I would want at least 1/2000th of a second to make sure I freeze their action. So this is just a nice winter landscape. We had just gotten a ton of snow, And over the winter, I was frequenting the Cache Creek area. There's a lot of trails there that are still open through the winter. And this is the Hagen Trail. And it's just a beautiful landscape, beautiful canyon. There was some weather coming in, as you can see from the mountains in the distance being a little obscured. And it's partially just a nice winter landscape. It was also just sentimental because I was hiking there a lot and had a lot of really good memories this summer being out there and frequenting these trails. And for this one, for the settings, this was f16, which I usually use for landscapes. And I had the ISO at 1000 because as bright as it looks, it was very overcast. So even with all the snow, it was still kind of dark and gray. So to bring out a lot of that exposure, I pushed up the ISO a little bit, and that gave me a 1/200th second exposure, which is plenty for hand-holding a landscape, which I usually do as I'm hiking along. This one I loved, and I thought it came out really well. We had just gotten an historic snow the day before. It dumped 2 feet of snow here in one night, which is absurd. And the red poles were out looking for some food. And this is actually the same spotted knapweed they were on just a couple of weeks prior when I was shooting with my daughter of that other photo. And you can see how much snow is actually there now. The knapweed was just barely poking out, and the red poles were trying to get to whatever they could. So I thought this turned out really well. It was an overcast day, but the clouds weren't heavy, so it was very bright. This allowed me to keep the ISO at 500, and at f8, this gave me 1/8000th of a second for this exposure, which is plenty to freeze the action, which it did as the male red pole started to fly away. Now, there wasn't anything too special about this, but it came out beautifully, and it's just a standard landscape of the peaks of the Tetons right as the first light is hitting them. And what helped it come out so great is that there were some clouds behind it which helped to darken the sky. Usually the sky behind the Tetons a little bit brighter with some extra clouds there. It was a little bit darker. So those dark clouds really helped to create a lot more contrast and made the scene much more beautiful than it would have been had it been a clear day. Now, because this was right at sunrise, there wasn't a whole lot of light to work with. So for the aperture, I stopped down to f8. And because there's so much distance between where I was and where the peaks were, f8 was still plenty to keep all the sharpness in the depth. I had pushed the ISO up to ISO 1000, which gave me a 1/400th of a shutter speed, which is probably still plenty. But in this case, it worked out really well. Now, this was just a nice find. Sometimes you just have some serendipitous encounters, and this was definitely one of them. This is a coyote that had just been feeding from a carcass, and that's why its face is completely bloody. It is filled with blood because it was eating from an elk. I just happened to catch it as it was wandering around on the hillside. And because I'd been planning on looking for birds and didn't expect to see many mammals, I also had my 2x extender on. So the settings were up pretty high, partially because of that, but also this was again before sunrise, which tends to be a good time to be out. So because it was before sunrise, I had the ISO up at 5000, and this was at f8, and that gave me 1/2500th of a second, which in this case was probably plenty. I could have stopped down that ISO a little bit more and pulled back on the shutter speed a little bit and still would have gotten a perfect picture. So I was driving around on the National Elk Refuge, seeing what kind of birds had gotten there, seeing that the bighorn sheep were being interesting, and it turns out the horned larks had migrated back in, and they were all over the roads because the ground was still covered in snow. So I managed to turn around and shoot behind me since there were still some there, and surprisingly, from within my car, I got a really great shot of this horned lark. I was really happy with the way it came out because usually from shooting in your car, you can tell that you're pointing down at something, and I don't like to shoot down at things. But in this case, there was still plenty of depth behind it. It looked really nice regardless. And on top of that, you can see the little horns on its head, which is what gave it its name. And these birds get overlooked a lot, and you can tell from this photo that they are actually a really pretty bird. Nice yellow chin, some really beautiful banding and striping on their wings, and overall just really happy with the way this one came out, and it was the ideal shot of a horned lark that I did not see coming at all. And because I was trying to capture them in flight and moving around a lot, which didn't work out quite as well, I did have the settings pushed up just a little bit, not too much to be too bad. Especially I'm shooting on the Canon R5, and ISO 2000, which I had this shot at, is really not that bad of a setting to do. Obviously you want to be as low as possible without compromising image quality or shutter speed or anything like that. But in this case, if I'm trying to make sure I can get birds sharp as they're flying around and moving around, I'm okay with pushing it up to 2000. And that's what this was at f8. That gave me 1/5000th of a second. And these are small birds, so that would have been a good shutter speed to freeze the action. There was one day in particular where my bird feeders just yielded a fantastic day. I had gray-crowned rosy finches, I had black finches in there, Cassin's finch, and common red poles all just going bananas at my bird feeder. And it was a beautiful day. It was overcast, so the lighting was good. Then a snowfall started to come in, which created an extra sense of mood. And I even made a whole video about that. It's a short, quick video, but it shows you more shots from what I got there. But this was definitely my favorite. And it stood out because it's just a beautiful portrait of a gray-crowned rosy finch just standing in the snow. And the snowfall had started. You can see the colors on this particular bird are just really bright, vibrant, and it's just a really pretty bird. This is the shot that I was hoping to get of one of them all winter long. And so really happy with the way this came out. And again, the settings I didn't need to push up too much because it was still pretty bright. So I had the ISO at 2500. I had f8 as my aperture, and then that gave me 1/3200th of a shutter speed, which was plenty enough to freeze all the action, which if you go check out that other video, you'll see there's other shots where they're jumping around, flying around, things like that. This was a shot I did not expect to get. I got really lucky with this. I was stopped along the road and I saw a moose and her calf behind the willows eating, and for whatever reason, the calf just decided to walk out and just walk straight toward my car. And this was right at sunrise, so there was some beautiful rim lighting, some backlighting behind him. Maybe it's a her. And just came out really stunning. Great shadows, great light, a beautiful winter scene. You got some frost and some snow still lingering on her. It was just a great encounter with this young moose. And so again, since this is a large mammal, I didn't need a fast shutter speed. So I had 1/1250th of a second, which was plenty to freeze a moose calf just walking along. So my ISO wasn't very high at all because of the backlighting that's essentially shooting more or less into the sun. So my ISO was at 320 at an aperture of f8. And what I was trying to do, when you have backlighting like that and rim lighting, what you want to do is expose for the highlights. And that's what I did here. That's why you don't need very much if you're trying to get that rim lighting. Because if you pull back and keep it exposed for those highlights, your shadows probably won't be too blown out that you can't recover them. A lot of people try to create a more even exposure by overblowing the shadows, but it's really the rim lighting in a photo like this that makes the photo so dramatic. And so that's what I was trying to preserve and go for. So this was just a really good encounter. I was walking along the Snake River later in the season and happened upon a couple of killdeer, and one of them was quite cooperative, just sat there on the other side of this little side stream of the river. And as the sun came up, it just lit it up beautifully. Great reflection, nice calm water, nice rocks. I wasn't too close. I wasn't trying to threaten it at all. Was definitely giving it some nice space. Just made a beautiful scene of this killdeer just sitting in the water. So since it wasn't moving around a lot, I didn't need a fast shutter speed. It seemed pretty content just sitting there. So I kept the shutter speed at 1/1250th of a second. And for that, I only needed an ISO of 1600 with an f8 aperture. And f8 is good for a lot of these small birds as well, because when you're zoomed in that much, if I go down to f4, it's going to create a lot more depth. I like having most of the bird in focus. As their tail kind of recedes, it blurs out a little bit in some cases. It's a good even number to make sure that the majority of the bird is in focus. So that way, let's say it focuses on the beak instead of the eye at f4, then you lose that whole photo because you don't have the eye in focus. Whereas f8, even if it hits close to the eye, like the beak, especially if it's looking more kind of to 3/4 to the side or so, you'll still have the eye in focus. So for my daughter's birthday, we went camping out west of Craters of the Moon, and there's a great little wildlife sanctuary there, the Carey Lake Wildlife Management Area. And in that particular instance, we saw several American coots, among other things. As one started to swim from one direction, another was coming the other direction, and they had kind of a little kerfluffle. And one of them started taking off, and I just sat down and started firing and seeing what I could get. And my daughter, with her toddler camera, who had just turned 4, had a really cute reaction. She got a little frustrated and said, "No fair, you always get it." And so maybe there's a new camera in her future someday. But she still had a lot of fun there. And for me, this is like almost the perfect takeoff scene. I had a shutter speed that kept the water splashing in focus. It wasn't blurred out. The wings aren't too blurred at all. My only complaint with this is that I clipped that wing that goes up to the top. That I wish I could fix, but at the same time, when things are moving that fast and I'm that zoomed in, it's hard to kind of navigate things like that. Overall, though, I am really happy with this. This is a great takeoff shot. There's a lot of water being splashed around. Everything's in focus. It looks really good. I'm happy with it. And it was just a fun morning to have with my daughter. She had a lot of fun being there. She wanted to keep walking and looking around and taking more pictures. So a great day out with her as well. So for this, didn't need really high settings. I was at aperture f8, and for the ISO, it was only 1000. There was some nice sunrise light coming up, so there was some good light that I didn't need to push up too high for, and that gave me 1/3200th of a second, which was plenty enough to freeze the action. And finally, managed to get a song sparrow. They were just starting to come back up into the valley, and found one calling on the National Elk Refuge, and the background's slightly busier than I would like, but it just turned out to be such a beautiful and moody shot. And the colors of the song sparrow just popped so much and so well that I just fell in love with it. I think the only thing it's really missing is a little bit of breath coming out of its beak, but with a shot this moody and this dramatic and beautiful, I'm happy with the way it is. So the settings for this one were aperture of f8. The ISO, it was early in the morning, so I had the ISO pushed up to 4000, and that gave me 1/1600th of a shutter speed, which would have been borderline if I were trying to catch it flying. It might have caught it, it might not. It's hard with those smaller birds to get it really in focus if it's anything less than 2000th of a shutter speed. So 1600th was definitely pushing it, but at the same time, it was just sitting there perched on this branch singing, so I wasn't too worried about it just yet. And so those are my favorite 20 images from this winter. What did you think? Did you have any favorites? Did you agree with what I said about each one? And again, if you are interested in any private photography workshops, check out the links in the description, and we'll go out and I will teach you as much as I can doing what we've been doing and teaching you in the field about how to use each setting and things like that, and finding all the wildlife and landscapes we can. So thanks for watching. Happy trails.